The man who predicted Hitler's rise, the Great Fire of London, and possibly 9/11 never set foot in the future. He sat in a stone tower in 16th century France, scribbling cryptic verses by candlelight, while plague corpses rotted in the streets below. His name was Michel de Nostradamus, and for nearly 5 centuries, people have been trying to decode what he saw. December 14th, 1503. The town of Saint-Rémy-de-Provence, nestled in the sun-baked hills of southern France, welcomed a child who would become history's most controversial prophet. But the world Michel entered wasn't waiting for visions of the distant future. It was barely surviving the present. His father, Jaume de Nostradamus, was a grain dealer and notary. Respectable work, certainly, but the family carried something that made them perpetual outsiders in Catholic France. They were Jewish converts, forced to abandon their faith just decades earlier, when King Charles VIII gave every Jew in Provence a simple choice: baptism or exile. The Nostradamus family chose survival. They took Christian names, attended Mass, and buried their Hebrew roots beneath layers of public piety. But in the privacy of their home, whispers of the old ways persisted. Michel's grandfather, Jean de Saint-Rémy, was a physician who'd retained his Jewish learning even as he adopted the cross. This grandfather would become Michel's first teacher, and what he taught went far beyond the approved curriculum of Christian Europe. Jean introduced young Michel to mathematics when most children were still learning their letters. He showed him the stars not as divine decorations, but as celestial mechanisms following predictable patterns. He taught him Greek and Latin, opening doors to ancient texts that the Church preferred remained closed. Most dangerously, he introduced Michel to what contemporaries called the celestial sciences: astrology, alchemy, the Kabbalah. Knowledge that could get a man burned. Picture a boy of perhaps 8 or 9, sitting in his grandfather's study as twilight painted the Provençal sky purple. Manuscripts in languages he's only beginning to understand surround him. His grandfather points to a chart showing planetary movements, explaining how the cosmos speaks to those who know its language. Outside, church bells call the faithful to Vespers. Inside, a different kind of faith is being transmitted. This dual education, this tension between public orthodoxy and private heterodoxy, would define everything Michel became. At 15, Michel left Saint-Rémy for Avignon to study the liberal arts. The university there was small but respected, a place where young men learned rhetoric, grammar, logic. The standard medieval curriculum designed to produce priests and lawyers. Michel absorbed it all with remarkable speed, but his interests were already drifting towards something the university viewed with suspicion: medicine. Then something happened that would reshape his entire trajectory. Plague arrived. The Black Death had never truly left Europe. It lurked in port cities, erupted in villages, and periodically swept through entire regions, like fire through dry grass. In 1520, as Michel prepared to continue his studies, an outbreak closed the University of Avignon. Students scattered. Some fled to their families. Others simply vanished into the chaos of a society trying to outrun invisible death. Michel made a different choice. While others ran from plague, he walked toward it. For the next several years, Michel worked as an apothecary's assistant, travelling through the French countryside, preparing remedies, observing the sick. He wasn't yet a licensed physician. He couldn't be. That required formal training, examinations, approval from medical faculties who guarded their profession jealously. But plague doesn't wait for credentials, and desperate towns welcomed anyone who claimed any knowledge of healing. What did Michel learn in those plague-ravaged villages? He saw that the standard treatments, bleeding and purging, seemed to kill as often as they cured. He noticed that the disease spread through contact, that isolating the sick slowed its progress. He began experimenting with his own remedies: pills made from rose hips, clean water, fresh air. Treatments that sound obvious now, but were radical departures from medieval medicine's reliance on balancing humours and consulting astrological charts for bloodletting times. He also learned something darker. He learned that most of his patients would die regardless of what he did. That medicine was as much about comfort as cure, and that sometimes the kindest thing a physician could do was simply be present while death did its work. By 1529, Michel felt ready for formal training. He enrolled at the University of Montpellier, one of Europe's oldest and most prestigious medical schools. Here, finally, was his chance to become a legitimate physician, to practice healing under the protection of institutional authority. He lasted less than 2 years. The medical faculty at Montpellier discovered that Michel had worked as an apothecary, a manual trade beneath the dignity of university-trained physicians. Worse, he had publicly criticized the treatments prescribed by established doctors. He'd suggested, heretically, that observation and experiment might teach more than ancient texts. The faculty expelled him. They called him an innovator, and they didn't mean it as a compliment. Most men would have been crushed by such a rejection. Michel simply ignored it. He set up practice anyway, without official approval, relying on reputation rather than credentials. And somehow, impossibly, it worked. Patients came. They recovered at rates that exceeded what licensed physicians achieved. Word spread of this unlicensed healer who defied convention and delivered results. He moved to Agen, a prosperous town in southwest France, and there his life briefly assumed a conventional shape. He married a woman whose name history has lost. We know she was beautiful. We know she came from a family of some means. We know she bore him 2 children. We know she died. Plague came to Agen in 1534. Michael's wife contracted it, then his children. The great healer, the man who'd walked through epidemic after epidemic unscathed, could not save his own family. He watched them sicken. He applied every treatment he knew. He prayed. They died anyway. The grief was crushing, but what followed was worse. His wife's family sued him for the return of her dowry. His professional rivals whispered that a physician who couldn't save his own wife was no physician at all. The Inquisition began asking questions about some of his statements that seemed to question church doctrine. Michael fled Agen. For the next 6 years, from 1534 to 1540, he vanished into what historians call his lost years. We have no records of where he went or what he did. Some accounts suggest he travelled to Italy. Others claim he ventured as far as Sicily or even the Middle East. A few whisper that he sought out secret schools of mystical learning. What we know for certain is that the man who emerged in 1540 was different from the one who'd fled. The physician was still there, but something else had been added, or awakened. Michel resurfaced in Marseille in 1544 when plague struck the city with unusual ferocity. The official physicians fled. Michel stayed. For 9 months, he worked without rest, treating the sick, organising quarantines, distributing his rose hip pills. The city's governing council was so grateful they awarded him a pension. Finally, recognition. Finally, security. He was 41 years old, scarred by loss, hardened by rejection, but undeniably successful. He could have stopped there. He could have spent his remaining years as a respected provincial doctor, comfortable and honoured. Instead, he married again. Her name was Anne Ponsard, a widow from Salon de Provence. She was wealthy, educated, and apparently willing to tolerate a husband whose interests extended far beyond respectable medicine. They married in 1547, and Michel moved to Salon, a small town about 20 miles from Marseille. He would never leave. The house he bought on the Rue de la Poissonnerie still stands. The upper floor contained his study, a room he increasingly retreated to as his medical practice thrived. Anne managed the household, bore him 6 children, and asked few questions about what her husband did in that upstairs room after the sun went down. What was he doing? The official story is that he was writing almanacs. These were popular publications that predicted weather, advised on planting crops, and included astrological forecasts for the coming year. Nothing suspicious there. Every astrologer in Europe published almanacs. It was how they made money. But Michel's almanacs were different. They sold extraordinarily well, spreading his name across France and into neighbouring countries. They contained predictions that seemed oddly specific, warnings that occasionally came true. People began consulting them, not just for farming advice, but for guidance on matters of state. And they contained verses, short, cryptic, 4-line poems called quatrains, predictions written in such obscure language that they could mean almost anything, or everything. In 1550, Michel published his first almanac under a Latinized version of his name. No longer Michel de Nostradamus, the expelled medical student and grief-stricken widower. Now he was Nostradamus, prophet of the age to come. The transformation was complete, but the real work was just beginning. Because in that upstairs study, by candlelight, Nostradamus was writing something far more ambitious than yearly forecasts. He was attempting to pierce the veil of time itself, to see centuries into a future he would never witness. He was writing prophecies that would outlive him by half a millennium. He was writing the book that would make him immortal. The method he used, the visions he claimed, the accuracy of what he saw, all of this remains violently contested. Believers point to predictions that seem impossible to explain as anything but genuine prescience. Skeptics argue that vague language and selective interpretation can make anything appear prophetic after the fact. But here's what nobody disputes: something happened in that room. Whether divine inspiration, astrological calculation, or elaborate fraud, Nostradamus produced a body of work that has never been definitively decoded and never stopped fascinating those who encounter it. The house on Rue de la Poissonnerie became a destination. Visitors arrived seeking prophecies, cures, astrological charts. The wealthy sent servants with requests. The powerful sent letters. Catherine de' Medici, soon to be Queen of France, heard of this provincial seer whose predictions were causing such excitement. She wanted to meet him. And when queens express interest, wise men comply. Nostradamus packed his papers and prepared for a journey that would thrust him into the dangerous centre of French court politics, where a single wrong prediction could mean not just professional ruin, but execution. The summons arrived in 1555. Catherine de' Medici, wife of King Henry II, requested the presence of Nostradamus at the royal court in Paris. This was not an invitation one could decline. The journey from Salon to Paris took weeks, travelling by horse-drawn carriage over roads that turned to mud in rain and dust in summer. Nostradamus was in his 50s now, suffering from a gout that made every jolt of the carriage agonizing. But he went. The alternative was to insult the future Queen of France, and that particular mistake tended to be fatal. Paris in the mid-16th century was a city of perhaps 300,000 souls, the largest in France and one of the great capitals of Europe. The royal palace at Les Tournelles sprawled across the right bank of the Seine, a maze of courtyards and halls where power was exercised through whispers and poison as much as through proclamations. Catherine de' Medici was the most powerful woman in France, possibly in all of Europe. Italian by birth, she had brought to the French court a sophistication and ruthlessness that made her both admired and feared. She was deeply interested in astrology, prophecy, and the occult arts. She maintained a network of seers and magicians who advised her on everything from matters of state to the health of her children. Why did she summon Nostradamus? The usual explanation is that she wanted him to cast horoscopes for her children, to tell her their futures, but there may have been something more. Catherine was a woman who collected power in every form. Knowledge was power. Prophecy was power. Having the most famous seer in France at her disposal was a statement, a warning to rivals that she possessed insights they lacked. Nostradamus arrived at court and was given rooms near the royal apartments. He was treated with respect, which must have been both gratifying and terrifying. Respect from royalty is a double-edged gift. It elevates you, certainly, but it also makes you responsible for everything you say. One wrong prediction, one prophecy that turned out embarrassingly false, and the same hands that offered you fine wine could sign your arrest warrant. The meeting with Catherine took place in private. No transcripts survive. We know only what Nostradamus later wrote in letters and what Catherine's own correspondence reveals. She wanted horoscopes for her children, all 7 of them. She wanted to know which would rule, which would prosper, which would die young. These were not idle curiosities. France was entering a period of extraordinary instability. The wars of religion would soon tear the country apart. Catherine needed to know which of her sons would survive to secure the dynasty. Nostradamus cast the charts. He studied the positions of the planets at each child's birth, calculated aspects and conjunctions, performed whatever calculations his astrological method required. Then he told Catherine what he had seen. 3 of her sons would become kings of France. This was a startling prediction. Henry II was healthy, still in his prime. The likelihood of 3 successive sons inheriting the throne seemed remote unless something catastrophic happened to the royal line. But Nostradamus was not finished. He also predicted, though perhaps not in so many words, that their reigns would be troubled, that France would suffer. Whether he specified the religious wars to come, the assassinations, the chaos, we cannot know. What we do know is that Catherine was satisfied. She rewarded Nostradamus generously and sent him back to Salon with her protection. That protection would prove valuable, because in 1558, 3 years after that meeting, something happened that cemented Nostradamus's reputation as a true prophet. King Henry II died, and he died in a way that seemed to fulfill one of the most famous quatrains Nostradamus had already published. The verse appeared in Century 1, quatrain 35, of his Book of Prophecies. It described a young lion defeating an old lion in combat. The old lion's eyes would be pierced through a golden cage, resulting in a cruel death. The language was typically obscure, but after the king's death, the meaning seemed horrifyingly clear. Henry II was 40 years old, not old, but older than his opponent. During a tournament celebrating a royal wedding, he jousted against Gabriel de Montgomery, the captain of his Scottish Guard. Montgomery was younger. Both men carried lances. Both wore helmets with golden visors. In medieval tournaments, lances were supposed to shatter on impact. The force dissipated safely. Montgomery's lance did not shatter. It struck the king's helmet. The wooden shaft splintered, and a piece drove through the golden visor into Henry's eye and penetrated his brain. The king lingered for 10 days in agony before dying. Catherine de' Medici became regent for her young son Francis II, the first of her 3 sons to rule, just as Nostradamus had predicted. The prophecy seemed undeniable. A young lion, an old lion, a golden cage, eyes pierced, cruel death. The details aligned with disturbing precision. Believers pointed to this as proof that Nostradamus possessed genuine prescient abilities. How else could he have described an event years before it occurred? Skeptics offered alternative explanations. Tournaments were dangerous. Knights died regularly from jousting accidents. Predicting that a king who participated in such events might die from one was not exactly miraculous. The language was vague enough that it could be applied to multiple scenarios. The golden cage could mean a helmet or a dozen other things. We see the connection because we know what happened, but before the event, the verse could have meant almost anything. This tension between belief and skepticism has defined Nostradamus's legacy ever since. Every generation finds new meanings in his verses, new events that seem to match his predictions. And every generation of skeptics demonstrates that with sufficiently flexible interpretation, almost any prediction can be made to fit almost any event. But something undeniable happened after Henry's death. Nostradamus became untouchable. The protection of Catherine de' Medici was now absolute. He was the prophet who had foreseen the king's death. He was famous across Europe, and he was free to continue his work without interference from authorities who might otherwise have questioned whether his prophecies bordered on heresy or treason. He returned to Salon and to the upstairs room where his real work continued. Because the almanacs, the royal horoscopes, the consultations with wealthy clients, all of this was secondary to the project that consumed him. The book. Les Prophéties, the prophecies. He had been writing it for years, filling page after page with 4-line verses, each one a coded glimpse of the future. The structure was unusual. Rather than organizing predictions chronologically, he arranged them in groups of 100, called centuries. Each century contained approximately 100 quatrains, though some centuries were incomplete. The order seemed random, as if he had deliberately scrambled the timeline to prevent readers from easily determining when each prophecy would be fulfilled. The language was intentionally obscure. Nostradamus wrote in Middle French, but he mixed in Latin, Provençal, Italian, and Greek words. He used anagrams, wordplay, and astronomical references. He named places and people, but often in ways that concealed as much as they revealed. A king might be called the Great Celt or the Destroyer of Villages. A city might be hidden behind an anagram or an ancient name, no longer in use. Why, if you possess knowledge of the future, why encode it so thoroughly that even you admit most readers will not understand until after the events occur? Nostradamus offered several explanations. He claimed that openly revealing the future would invite accusations of witchcraft and heresy. The Inquisition was still active, still burning those suspected of trafficking with demons. Prophecy that was too specific, too accurate, could be seen as evidence of diabolical inspiration rather than divine grace. He also suggested that some knowledge was too dangerous to reveal plainly. If a king knew he was destined to die in a particular way, he might alter his behavior, which could change the future, which would invalidate the prophecy, creating a paradox. Better to encode the information so it could only be understood after the fact, serving as confirmation rather than warning. Or perhaps, and this is the explanation skeptics favor, the obscurity was deliberate obfuscation. Vague predictions can be retrofitted to match any event. Specific predictions can be proven wrong. If your goal is to create a reputation as a prophet while protecting yourself from being definitively disproven, ambiguity is not a flaw, but a feature. The first edition of Les Prophéties appeared in 1555, the same year Nostradamus travelled to Paris. It contained the first 4 centuries, approximately 400 quatrains. The book was an immediate sensation. Copies sold rapidly, were reprinted, translated, and circulated across Europe. Readers pored over the verses, trying to decode their meanings, arguing about which prophecies referred to which events. Some verses seemed to describe recent history, the Protestant Reformation, wars in Italy, conflicts between France and Spain. These were easily understood and increased confidence that Nostradamus was describing real events, not inventing fantasies. Other verses described things that had not yet happened: disasters, wars, the fall of cities, the rise and fall of leaders. These generated endless speculation. Nostradamus published additional centuries over the following years. By the time of his death in 1566, he had completed 10 centuries, though the 10th was incomplete. The full collection amounted to nearly 1,000 quatrains, a massive body of prophetic work covering, he claimed, events from his own time until the end of the world, which he dated to the year 3797. How did he do it? What method did he use to perceive the future? Nostradamus was never entirely clear on this point, which has led to centuries of speculation. In the preface to Les Prophéties, addressed to his infant son Caesar, he described his method in characteristically vague terms. He spoke of perfect knowledge of future events, obtained through calculation of astronomical movements combined with divine inspiration. He referenced ancient practices, the use of water in a brass bowl as a scrying medium, nighttime sessions when his mind was most receptive. He described entering a trance-like state, a flame appearing, a divine presence filling the room. In these moments, he claimed, he could see across time, witnessing events centuries ahead as clearly as if they were happening before his eyes. He saw cities burning, leaders falling, nations rising. He saw technologies that did not yet exist, weapons beyond current imagination, transformations of human society so profound they defied description in the language of his time. Or so he claimed. The alternative explanation is more mundane. Nostradamus was a well-educated man with access to historical texts, astrological treatises, and political intelligence. He understood the patterns of history, the cycles of war and peace, the way power shifted between nations. He could make educated guesses about future conflicts based on current tensions. He could predict that Protestant and Catholic factions would continue fighting because they were already fighting. He could foresee that the Ottoman Empire would remain a threat to Europe because it had been a threat for decades. His prophecies of distant future events could simply be extrapolations, imaginative projections of contemporary trends into centuries ahead. His use of obscure language ensured that whatever happened, someone could find a quatrain that seemed to predict it. The method, in this view, was not mystical vision but clever literary construction designed to create the appearance of prophecy while remaining unfalsifiable. But explaining away Nostradamus is not quite as simple as skeptics sometimes suggest, because some of his predictions, even allowing for ambiguous language and selective interpretation, seem to describe specific events with unsettling accuracy. The death of Henry II is one example. There are others, predictions that appear to match events that occurred decades or even centuries after Nostradamus died. Century 9, Quatrain 20, describes a night attack across a bridge. Many interpreters believe this refers to Napoleon Bonaparte's crossing of the Arcole Bridge during his Italian campaign in 1796, more than 2 centuries after the verse was written. Century 2, Quatrain 51, mentions London's burning and the year 66, which seems to predict the Great Fire of London in 1666, exactly a century after Nostradamus' death. Century 1, Quatrain 60, describes an emperor born near Italy who will cost the empire very dearly. He will be less a prince than a butcher. Napoleon was born in Corsica, technically Italian territory at the time, became emperor, and his wars cost France enormous casualties. The verse seems remarkably apt. The most famous and controversial example concerns Hitler. Century 2, Quatrain 24, refers to Easter, which believers identify as an anagram or near match for Hitler. The verse describes beasts ferocious, with hunger crossing rivers, suggesting the German invasions of World War II. Skeptics counter that Easter is actually an old Latin name for the Danube River, and that finding Hitler in the verse requires creative reading. This pattern repeats throughout the centuries since Nostradamus died. Each generation discovers new relevance in his prophecies, finding their own crises, their own leaders, their own disasters hidden in the cryptic quatrains. World War I, the atomic bomb, the September 11th attacks, climate change, pandemics, all have been found in Nostradamus' verses by those determined to find them. The question is whether this represents genuine prophecy or the human tendency to find patterns in randomness, to see meaning in ambiguity. We want to believe that someone knew, that the chaos of history follows some comprehensible pattern, that the future is not simply random but predetermined and knowable. Nostradamus offers that comfort, the possibility that someone understood what was coming, even if his understanding was too complex for us to grasp until after the fact. Meanwhile, in Salon, Nostradamus continued his work. His fame brought wealth. The house on Rue de la Poissonnerie was expanded. His medical practice thrived. Wealthy clients paid extraordinary sums for personal consultations, for horoscopes, for glimpses into their futures. He had achieved everything a provincial physician could hope for: prosperity, security, fame. But his health was deteriorating. The gout that had plagued him for years worsened. He developed dropsy, swelling in his legs that made movement painful. By 1566, he was in his 60s, old by the standards of his time, and clearly approaching the end. He knew it. He made his will, arranged his affairs, and prepared to meet the future he had spent his life trying to predict. On the night of July 1st, 1566, Nostradamus called for his lawyer and notary. He dictated a codicil to his will, making final adjustments to the distribution of his estate. When the business was concluded, he told his secretary Jean de Chavigny that he would not be alive when the sun rose. Chavigny, devoted to his master, protested. Nostradamus was ill, yes, but he had been ill before. He would recover. He always recovered. Nostradamus shook his head. He knew. The next morning, July 2nd, Jean de Chavigny found his master's body exactly as predicted. Nostradamus had died during the night, apparently from the complications of his dropsy. He was 62 years old. The man who had spent decades predicting the deaths of others had accurately foreseen his own. The irony was not lost on his contemporaries. He was buried in the church of the Cordeliers in Salon, standing upright in the wall as he had requested. His tomb bore a Latin inscription praising his almost divine pen and his ability to write of future events. The inscription called him worthy of immortal remembrance. It was an extraordinary epitaph for a provincial doctor who had published verses in French rather than proper Latin. But then, Nostradamus had never been an ordinary physician. His death did not end his influence. If anything, it amplified it. The prophecies continued to be published, translated, interpreted. New editions appeared regularly, each generation discovering fresh relevance in the ancient verses. The phenomenon accelerated with the invention of printing technology that made books cheap and accessible. By the 17th century, Nostradamus was a household name across Europe. His prophecies were debated in salons and taverns, cited by scholars and charlatans alike. Kings consulted his verses before making decisions. Military commanders searched for predictions of their victories or defeats. The wealthy paid astrologers to interpret what Nostradamus had written about their personal futures. Some of this was driven by genuine belief, but much of it was simply fashion. Nostradamus had become a cultural phenomenon, and citing his prophecies was a mark of sophistication, a way to demonstrate that one was educated and in touch with mysterious forces beyond ordinary understanding. The French Revolution in 1789 produced a fresh wave of Nostradamus fever. Revolutionaries and royalists both claimed his prophecies supported their cause. Century 9, Quatrain 20, which mentions a king of terror coming from the sky, was interpreted as predicting the fall of the monarchy. Century 1, Quatrain 14, which describes the Great Assembly cutting the throat of the innocent, seemed to foretell the execution of Louis XVI. When Napoleon rose to power, new interpreters emerged to explain how Nostradamus had predicted this too. The emperor born near Italy, the crossing of rivers, the transformation of Europe, all apparently hidden in the cryptic verses. The 19th century brought scientific skepticism. Rationalists dismissed Nostradamus as a fraud or a madman. His defenders responded by finding new predictions in his work, matching the Industrial Revolution, the rise of democracy, technological innovations to specific quatrains. The debate became increasingly sophisticated, with both sides marshalling evidence and counter-evidence. But the 20th century would provide the most dramatic test of Nostradamus's prophetic abilities. The catastrophes of the modern era, 2 world wars, the Holocaust, nuclear weapons, terrorism, would either vindicate his prophecies or expose them as meaningless. The verses that seem to predict Hitler have already been mentioned, but there are others that believers cite as evidence of Nostradamus's knowledge of 20th century horrors. Century 2, quatrain 29, mentions the Oriental leaving his seat and crossing mountains to reach France. Some interpret this as predicting Hirohito or the broader threat of Asian powers during World War II. Century 6, quatrain 34, describes fire falling from the sky and burning a city. Believers see Hiroshima, skeptics see a generic description that could apply to any bombing in any war throughout history. The pattern continues. Century 10, quatrain 72, mentions the year 1999 and the King of Terror descending from the sky. When 1999 passed without obvious catastrophe, interpreters adjusted. Perhaps the verse referred to the September 11th attacks 2 years later. Perhaps it was symbolic rather than literal. Perhaps the calendar calculations were slightly off. This flexibility is both the strength and weakness of Nostradamus's prophecies. They can never be definitively proven false because they can always be reinterpreted. But neither can they be definitively proven true because the reinterpretation is always done after the fact. Still, the phenomenon persists. Every major crisis produces new books about Nostradamus. The coronavirus pandemic generated dozens of publications claiming he predicted it. Climate change, political upheavals, economic collapses, all are supposedly hidden in his verses, waiting to be discovered by those with eyes to see. Why does this continue? Why more than 4 centuries after his death do millions still consult Nostradamus when facing uncertainty? Part of the answer lies in the nature of prophecy itself. We live in a world of overwhelming complexity where events seem random and meaningless. Prophecy offers the comfort of pattern, the suggestion that history follows some comprehensible design. If Nostradamus knew what was coming, then perhaps the chaos is not chaos at all, but part of some larger plan we simply don't understand yet. There's also the appeal of exclusivity. Interpreting Nostradamus requires skill, knowledge, insight. Those who claim to understand his prophecies position themselves as special, as possessing wisdom that ordinary people lack. It's a form of social distinction, a way to claim authority in an uncertain world. And there's the undeniable thrill of mystery. The verses are genuinely cryptic. They tantalize. They suggest meaning without quite revealing it. Solving a Nostradamus quatrain feels like cracking a code, like gaining access to forbidden knowledge. That feeling is addictive, but perhaps the deepest reason for Nostradamus's enduring appeal is more fundamental. We are afraid. We are afraid of the future, afraid of death, afraid of catastrophe. Nostradamus offers the possibility that someone understands, that someone saw what was coming. Even if his prophecies predict disaster, at least they suggest that disaster has meaning, that it's part of some larger pattern. That's more comforting than accepting that terrible things happen randomly, that history is chaos, that no one knows what comes next. Of course, accepting that uncertainty is exactly what skeptics argue we must do. They point out that every generation finds its own crises in Nostradamus because the verses are deliberately vague enough to fit almost anything. The prophecies are like Rorschach tests, revealing more about the interpreter than about the future. A verse mentioning fire from the sky could mean meteors, bombing raids, missiles, or divine wrath depending on what the reader fears most. The reference to Hester could be the Danube River or Hitler depending on whether you're writing in 1550 or 1950. This doesn't make Nostradamus a conscious fraud. He may have genuinely believed he was receiving visions of the future. His use of obscure language and mixed chronology might have been an honest attempt to record confusing prophetic experiences rather than a deliberate strategy to make his predictions unfalsifiable. We'll never know what Nostradamus actually saw in his midnight vigils, what visions appeared to him as he stared into his bowl of water. We only know what he wrote down, and what he wrote down is ambiguous enough that it will probably continue to fascinate and frustrate readers for centuries to come. What we can say with certainty is that Nostradamus understood something profound about human psychology. Whether or not he could see the future, he understood that people desperately want to believe someone can. He understood that prophecy gains power from obscurity, that the less clear a prediction is, the more situations it can apply to. He understood that people will work hard to find meaning in cryptic statements, doing much of the prophet's work for him. In this sense, his greatest prophecy might have been about himself. He predicted that his name would endure, that his work would be debated and studied long after his death. That prophecy, at least, has proven absolutely accurate. The house on Rue de la Poissonnerie in Salon still stands. It's now a museum dedicated to Nostradamus, filled with exhibits about his life, his prophecies, his methods. Tourists from around the world visit to see where he lived and worked, to stand in the room where he wrote his prophecies, to touch the past and perhaps glimpse the future. His tomb in the church of the Cordeliers was disturbed during the French Revolution. Revolutionaries broke it open, scattering his bones. According to legend, they found a medallion around the skeleton's neck, engraved with the date 1791, the year of the tomb's desecration. The story is almost certainly false, but it perfectly captures the Nostradamus phenomenon. Even in death, he seems to have known what was coming. His bones were eventually recovered and reburied. They rest now in the church of Saint-Laurent in Salon, beneath a plaque that identifies him as the most famous resident the town has ever known. The prophecies remain in print, still bestsellers during times of crisis. New interpreters continue to emerge, each claiming to have finally decoded the master's true meaning. The internet has only amplified the phenomenon. Websites and videos dissect individual quatrains, finding contemporary relevance in 16th century French verses. Social media spreads new interpretations instantly across the globe. During the pandemic, Nostradamus memes went viral, with people sharing verses they claimed predicted the crisis. Most of these were misquotations or outright fabrications, but they spread anyway because people wanted to believe that someone, somewhere, had known this was coming. That desire to believe that someone knows, that someone saw, that the future is not simply unknown but knowable, may be Nostradamus' true legacy. Not the accuracy of his prophecies, but the human need to believe in prophecy itself. He tapped into something fundamental about how we relate to time and uncertainty. He created a text that functions like a mirror, reflecting back whatever fears and hopes we bring to it. In that sense, Nostradamus was less a prophet than a genius of ambiguity, someone who understood that the most powerful predictions are the ones that can mean anything. Whether he actually saw the future or simply understood human nature well enough to create something that would outlive him by centuries remains an open question. But 450 years after his death, we're still talking about him, still debating his prophecies, still searching his verses for clues about what comes next. That alone suggests he understood something important about the relationship between past, present and future, even if what he understood was simply that we can never stop trying to know what we cannot know. But what if we're asking the wrong question? What if the real story isn't whether Nostradamus could see the future, but how he learned to see the present so clearly? The man who would become history's most famous prophet didn't start out claiming supernatural powers. He began as a doctor during the worst medical crisis Europe had ever seen, and what he learned in those plague-ravaged towns would shape everything he later wrote. Understanding Nostradamus requires understanding the plague years, because they transformed him. They showed him how societies collapse, how people behave when death surrounds them, how power structures crumble and reform. These weren't mystical visions. They were observations, patterns he recognized by watching the same horrors unfold in town after town. The plague arrived in waves throughout the 16th century. When it hit a community, perhaps a third of the population would die within weeks. Nostradamus walked into these nightmares repeatedly, offering what help he could while most doctors fled. He saw things that would haunt anyone, but he also saw patterns. He noticed that certain behaviours spread disease while others contained it. He observed how panic could be as destructive as the illness itself. He watched leaders make the same mistakes repeatedly, saw crowds turn on scapegoats, witnessed the predictable progression from fear to violence to exhausted acceptance. These observations gave him something valuable, a map of how humans respond to crisis. Not prophecy, but psychology. Not mysticism, but pattern recognition. His plague remedies, the rose pills, the emphasis on cleanliness, the dietary recommendations weren't magic. They were early public health measures based on careful observation. Some worked, some probably didn't. But the approach itself was revolutionary. Systematic observation leading to practical intervention. This same methodology appears in his prophecies, though disguised in mystical language. He wasn't channeling spirits, he was extrapolating from patterns. He'd seen how religious conflicts escalated, how royal succession disputes led to war, how economic pressures created social instability. He'd watched these patterns play out across France and Italy for decades. The prophecies apply the same thinking he used in medicine: observe the symptoms, identify the pattern, predict the likely progression. Except instead of diagnosing individuals, he was diagnosing civilizations. Consider his most famous prediction about the Great Fire of London. The verses mention a great fire consuming a city, blood in the streets, a king displaced. Interpreters point to this as proof he saw 1666 specifically. But fires regularly destroyed medieval cities. Political violence was constant. Monarchs were frequently overthrown. He wasn't predicting a specific event so much as describing a category of events that happened repeatedly. This is why his prophecies seem to work. They describe patterns that recur throughout history. Every generation finds its own fire, its own war, its own catastrophe that seems to match what Nostradamus wrote. The prophecies function like templates that can be filled in with whatever crisis is currently unfolding. His medical work reveals something else crucial. Nostradamus understood the power of presentation. His plague remedies came wrapped in elaborate instructions, complex recipes, precise rituals. Were all these details necessary? Probably not. But they made the remedies seem more powerful, more authoritative. The same theatrical instinct shaped his prophecies. The midnight sessions, the elaborate preparation rituals, the archaic language, the astronomical references, all of this created an aura of profound mystery. He was performing the role of prophet, understanding that the performance itself was part of what made people believe. This doesn't necessarily mean he was consciously deceiving anyone. Performance and belief aren't opposites. He may have genuinely believed his visions were divinely inspired while simultaneously crafting them for maximum impact. The human mind is capable of remarkable self-deception, especially when that deception serves a larger purpose. What was that purpose? Partly fame, certainly, partly money. He made a comfortable living from his prophecies, but there's evidence of something deeper. His prophecies consistently warn against religious fanaticism, tyrannical rulers, and the horrors of war. They're not neutral predictions. They carry moral weight, urging readers toward tolerance and away from violence. In this sense, Nostradamus wasn't trying to reveal the future so much as prevent certain futures. The prophecies function as warnings. This is where your current path leads. His medical work followed the same logic. Intervene early to prevent catastrophe. The ambiguity that makes his prophecies so adaptable may have been intentional for exactly this reason. By keeping them vague, he ensured they could speak to multiple generations facing different crises. Each era could find its own warning in his verses, its own call to choose differently. But there's a paradox here. If the prophecies are warnings meant to change behavior, then accurate predictions would represent failures. If people see the catastrophe coming and do nothing to prevent it, the prophecy hasn't served its purpose. The goal isn't prediction but prevention. This explains why Nostradamus' defenders aren't bothered by failed prophecies. The prophecy that doesn't come true might be the most successful one, because perhaps it warned people away from that particular disaster. Failure becomes success, inaccuracy becomes proof of effectiveness. It's an unfalsifiable position, but that doesn't mean it's entirely wrong. The real Nostradamus emerges somewhere between charlatan and prophet, a brilliant observer of human behavior who packaged his insights in mystical language because that's what his era would accept. A doctor who understood patterns and probabilities, trying to inoculate society against its own worst tendencies. A performer who believed his own performance because the alternative, that history is just chaos with no pattern, was too terrifying to accept. His medical training shaped everything. In medicine, you learn that the body follows predictable patterns. Certain symptoms lead to certain outcomes, unless you intervene. Disease progresses in recognizable stages. Treatments work or don't work, based on observable principles, even if you don't understand the underlying mechanisms. Nostradamus applied this medical model to history itself. Societies have symptoms: religious extremism, economic inequality, succession crises. These symptoms progress in predictable ways unless someone intervenes. Wars follow patterns. Revolutions follow patterns. Even natural disasters, while unpredictable in their specific timing, recur in recognizable forms. His prophecies catalogue these patterns. They're less predictions than diagnoses. Here are the symptoms I observe. Here's where they typically lead. The mystical language obscures this analytical framework, but it's there in the structure of the verses themselves. This interpretation explains both his successes and failures. When he seems accurate, it's because he correctly identified a recurring historical pattern. When he seems wrong, it's because he misread the symptoms or because circumstances changed in ways he didn't anticipate. Medicine doesn't work perfectly either. Doctors make wrong diagnoses all the time. That doesn't mean medicine is worthless. The question becomes, did Nostradamus himself understand this? Did he know he was doing sophisticated pattern analysis rather than receiving divine visions? The evidence suggests both yes and no. His letters show a man who took his work seriously, who spent enormous time studying history, astronomy, medicine, and current events. He wasn't just sitting in a dark room waiting for visions. He was researching, analysing, connecting disparate pieces of information. This was intellectual work, not passive reception. But he also genuinely believed in astrology, in divine providence, in the possibility of prophetic insight. His worldview allowed for both careful analysis and mystical revelation. They weren't contradictory to him. The analysis prepared the ground for genuine prophetic insight to emerge. Modern minds struggle with this because we separate rational analysis from mystical experience. But Nostradamus lived in an era that saw no such division. Mathematics was connected to mysticism. Medicine included prayer alongside treatment. Astronomy and astrology were the same discipline. His prophecies reflect this integrated worldview. They combine careful political analysis with astrological calculation, historical pattern recognition with apocalyptic religious imagery. The result is something that can be read either as sophisticated political commentary or as mystical revelation, depending on what the reader brings to it. This flexibility is precisely what's allowed the prophecies to survive. Scientific materialists can see pattern recognition and political analysis. Religious believers can see divine inspiration. Mystics can see occult wisdom. Everyone finds something, and what they find tells us as much about them as about Nostradamus. His own life demonstrates this flexibility. He was simultaneously a respected physician and a controversial prophet. He served royalty while maintaining friendships with common people. He was devoutly Catholic while studying texts the Church considered heretical. He published his prophecies while carefully avoiding any interpretation that would anger the Inquisition. This balancing act required extraordinary intelligence and political skill. He was navigating a world where religious wars were tearing France apart, where one wrong word could lead to execution, where powerful enemies looked for any excuse to destroy him. The ambiguity of his prophecies wasn't just mystical, it was survival strategy. The verses could be read as supporting Catholic interests or Protestant interests, as defending the monarchy or warning against tyranny, as prophesying doom or promising salvation. This ambiguity kept everyone interested while giving no one enough ammunition to destroy him. It was brilliant political maneuvering disguised as prophetic mystery. His success depended on this ambiguity. If he'd been too specific, he would have been proven wrong quickly and his reputation destroyed. If he'd been too vague, no one would have taken him seriously. He found the perfect balance, specific enough to seem meaningful, vague enough to be interpreted multiple ways. This balance extended to his personal life. He was famous enough to attract royal attention, but not so prominent that every aspect of his life faced scrutiny. Wealthy enough to be comfortable, but not so rich that he attracted dangerous envy. Connected enough to have powerful protectors, but independent enough to maintain his own voice. The plague years had taught him this balance too. Doctors who claimed too much faced angry mobs when patients died. Doctors who claimed too little were dismissed as useless. The effective doctor projected confidence while managing expectations, offered hope while acknowledging uncertainty, appeared knowledgeable while admitting the limits of knowledge. Nostradamus transferred these lessons from medicine to prophecy. He projected certainty while building in plausible deniability. He offered hope that the future could be known, while acknowledging that his visions were difficult to interpret. He appeared to possess special knowledge, while suggesting that understanding required study and insight that not everyone possessed. This created a perfect dynamic. Believers could point to apparent successes as proof. Skeptics could point to failures as evidence of fraud. But the conversation itself kept his name alive, kept people reading his prophecies, kept the mystery active across generations. He understood something fundamental about human psychology. We're more interested in questions than answers. A mystery solved is a mystery dead, but a mystery that seems perpetually on the verge of being solved, that offers just enough clarity to keep us engaged while maintaining just enough obscurity to prevent final understanding. That's a mystery that lives forever. The prophecies are designed this way. Each quatrain seems almost clear, almost interpretable. You feel like you're on the verge of understanding, like just a bit more knowledge or insight would unlock the meaning. But that understanding remains perpetually out of reach, always just beyond the next interpretation, the next analysis, the next revelation. This is why new books about Nostradamus keep appearing. This is why the prophecies keep finding new audiences. Each generation thinks it has the key that previous generations missed. Each crisis brings new interpreters convinced they've finally decoded the master's true meaning. The prophecies function like a perpetual motion machine, generating endless interpretation without ever running out of mystery. Whether Nostradamus intended this or simply stumbled onto a formula that happened to work this way remains unclear. The evidence supports both possibilities. He was certainly smart enough to engineer this effect deliberately, but he may also have been sincere in his belief that he was recording genuine visions, with the interpretive ambiguity being an unintended consequence of trying to describe the indescribable. What's certain is that he created something that has outlived every other prophet of his era. The centuries continue to sell, new interpretations continue to emerge, the debates continue unabated. And perhaps that's the real prophecy, not specific predictions about future events, but the prediction that we would never stop searching for them. By 1564, Nostradamus had become something more than a man. He was an institution, a living legend whose very presence in Salon drew visitors from across Europe. Kings sought his counsel, nobles commissioned private consultations, scholars debated his methods, but the body that housed this legend was failing rapidly. The gout that had plagued him for years was worsening. His legs swelled grotesquely. Walking became agony, then became impossible. He moved through his house with difficulty, relying on servants and furniture to support his weight. The dropsy followed, fluid accumulating in his tissues, making breathing difficult. His face puffed, his hands swelled. The man who had survived the plague, who had walked through infected cities when younger doctors fled, now found his own body betraying him from within. He knew what was coming. A doctor recognizes the signs, the accumulating symptoms, the progressive weakness, the way his body was systematically shutting down. He had perhaps weeks, possibly months, but not years. This knowledge shaped his final days in ways both practical and profound. On June 17th, he summoned a notary named Joseph Roche to his home. The will he dictated was detailed and careful, the document of a man who had accumulated significant wealth and wanted to ensure its proper distribution. He left money to the poor of Salon. He provided dowries for young girls without means. He divided his considerable estate among his wife and children, specifying exact amounts and particular items. The house in Salon with its secret study went to Anne. Specific pieces of furniture were designated for particular children. Books were carefully allocated among his sons. The will reveals a man concerned with fairness, with providing for his family, with ensuring that the reputation he had built would not be squandered in disputes over inheritance. But the most striking element appears in a codicil added just 2 weeks later. Nostradamus specified exactly where and how he wanted to be buried. He requested that his body be placed upright in the wall of the Church of the Cordeliers in Salon, standing rather than lying down. The reason remains mysterious. Some interpreted it as a final gesture of defiance, refusing to lie down even in death. Others saw it as ensuring he would be literally upright on Judgment Day, ready to face whatever came. Still others suggested it was meant to prevent anyone from walking over his grave, a concern that seems oddly specific unless he anticipated people trying to do exactly that. The summer heat intensified. Nostradamus weakened daily. By early July, he was confined to his bed, unable to move without assistance. His breathing grew laboured. The fluid in his lungs made each breath a struggle. His secretary, Jean de Chavigny, remained with him, recording his master's final words and actions with the devotion of a disciple documenting a saint's passing. On the 1st of July, Nostradamus called Chavigny to his bedside. The conversation that followed would be endlessly analysed by later commentators. Nostradamus allegedly told his secretary that he would not find him alive at sunrise. The prophecy of his own death, delivered with the same certainty he had brought to predictions about kings and kingdoms. Whether this was genuine prescience or simply a dying man's awareness of his body's failing systems remains debatable. Doctors often know when the end is imminent. The signs are clear to those trained to read them. Chavigny asked if there was anything his master needed. Nostradamus reportedly replied that he had no further need of doctors or medicines. The irony was heavy. The man who had made his fortune treating others now acknowledged that his condition was beyond treatment, that the skills he had used to heal countless patients could not save himself. That night, Nostradamus struggled to breathe. The dropsy had reached his lungs. Each breath came harder than the last. Sometime in the early hours of July 2nd, Between darkness and dawn, Michel de Nostradamus died. He was 62 years old. The prophecy to Chavigny had proven accurate. The secretary did not find him alive at sunrise. The funeral was held 2 days later. Despite the summer heat that would have made delay impossible, the ceremony was elaborate. The entire town turned out. Nobles from nearby estates attended. The body was dressed in fine clothes and, as specified in the will, placed upright in the wall of the Church of the Cordeliers. A plaque was mounted nearby, commemorating his life and work. The Latin inscription praised his learning, his medical skill, and his prophetic gifts. It suggested that future generations would recognize what his own age had only begun to understand. Anne survived him by 16 years, dying in 1582. She never remarried, maintaining the household in Salon and protecting her husband's reputation and legacy. Chavigny took on the role of official interpreter and defender of the prophecies, publishing commentaries and explanations that would shape how future generations understood his master's work. But death did not end Nostradamus' story. In some ways, it only began the transformation from man to myth. The prophecies took on new life after his death. Without their author to clarify or contextualize, they became pure text, open to any interpretation that seemed to fit. The ambiguity that had been a feature became the defining characteristic. Each new generation found its own crises reflected in the quatrains. Each new catastrophe produced interpreters convinced they had found the relevant prophecy that predicted exactly what had just occurred. In 1791, more than 2 centuries after Nostradamus' death, French revolutionaries broke into the Church of the Cordeliers. They were destroying religious symbols, smashing monuments to the old order. Someone noticed the upright body in the wall, the plaque identifying the famous prophets. The story that spread claimed they opened the wall and found the body perfectly preserved, that a medallion around the skeleton's neck bore the date 1791, that Nostradamus had predicted even this desecration. The story is almost certainly false, invented by royalist sympathizers to suggest divine disapproval of the revolution, but it spread anyway, becoming part of the legend. The actual fate of the remains was more prosaic. They were moved several times over the following years as the church underwent renovations and changes. Eventually, they were placed in a different wall of a different church, the Collegiate Saint-Laurent in Salon, where they remain today. A plaque marks the spot. Tourists photograph it. The legend persists. Throughout the 19th century, new editions of the prophecies appeared. Publishers added illustrations, helpful indexes, explanatory notes that grew longer than the original text. The quatrains were reorganized, cross-referenced, analyzed from every conceivable angle. Each major event, wars, revolutions, natural disasters, produced a wave of new interpretations showing how Nostradamus had predicted it centuries earlier. The 20th century brought even more attention. The world wars were particularly fertile ground. Interpreters found prophecies about Hitler, about atomic bombs, about the Holocaust. During World War II, both Allied and Nazi propagandists used manipulated versions of Nostradamus' prophecies to boost morale or demoralize enemies. Fake quatrains were created and circulated, adding to the confusion about what Nostradamus had actually written. The pattern was always the same. After a major event, interpreters would search the centuries for quatrains that seemed relevant. The language was sufficiently vague that something could usually be found. Geographic names could be creatively interpreted. Symbolic imagery could be decoded in multiple ways. And if a quatrain didn't quite fit, selective editing or creative translation could usually force the connection. Critics pointed out the obvious problem. These predictions were only identified after the events occurred. Before a major event, no one could point to a specific quatrain and say with certainty what was about to happen. The prophecies worked backwards, never forwards. They explained the past but never successfully predicted the future. Believers had responses ready. Nostradamus had deliberately obscured his meanings to avoid persecution. The prophecies required deep study and insight to interpret. The truth would only become clear to those who approached the work with proper understanding and respect. The ambiguity was not a bug, but a feature, protection against those who would misuse the knowledge. This defense was perfect because it was unfalsifiable. Any failed prediction could be explained away as misinterpretation. Any successful match could be claimed as proof. The system was self-sealing, immune to disproof. Modern scholars approaching Nostradamus face a challenge. On one hand, dismissing him entirely means ignoring a genuinely fascinating historical figure who influenced centuries of European thought. On the other hand, taking the prophecies seriously as predictions means abandoning intellectual rigor. The solution has been to study Nostradamus as a cultural phenomenon rather than as an accurate prophet. What emerges from serious historical analysis is more interesting than simple fortune-telling. Nostradamus appears as a product of his time, shaped by Renaissance humanism, medical training, astrological tradition, and the psychological trauma of plague years. His prophecies reflect 16th century anxieties about religious conflict, political instability, and cosmic catastrophe. They're less predictions about our future than expressions of his present, his fears and hopes projected forward. The medical work reveals something similar. Nostradamus's plague remedies seem bizarre to modern medicine. Rose pills, sawdust absorption, avoiding bloodletting. But within 16th century medical understanding, they represented innovative thinking. He was working at the edge of contemporary knowledge, trying approaches that differed from standard practice. Some probably helped, most probably did nothing. None addressed the actual bacterial cause that wouldn't be discovered for another 3 centuries. His genius lay not in supernatural insight, but in understanding what people wanted and how to provide it. During the plague, people wanted hope, action, someone who seemed to know what to do when everyone else was panicking. His confident bedside manner, his unusual treatments, his survival when other doctors died, all of this created a reputation for effectiveness that may have exceeded his actual medical skill. With the prophecies, people wanted assurance that someone understood the patterns underlying historical chaos. They wanted to believe the future was knowable, that seemingly random catastrophes followed some divine or cosmic plan. Nostradamus provided that assurance. His prophecies suggested pattern where there might be only chaos, meaning where there might be only accident. This psychological service explains the endurance. Each generation faces its own crises, its own fears about the future. Each generation wants reassurance that these crises are part of some larger pattern, that they were foreseen, that they fit into a comprehensible framework. The prophecies offer this reassurance. They're Rorschach tests where each era projects its own anxieties and finds them reflected back. The man himself recedes behind the myth. We know the basic facts. Born in Saint-Rémy, educated as a doctor, survived the plague, published prophecies, served Catherine de Medici, died in Salon. But the inner life, the actual thoughts and motivations, the question of whether he believed his own claims, these remain elusive. The primary sources are limited. What exists was often written by devoted followers with their own agendas. Nostradamus' own writings mix genuine autobiography with self-promotion. Separating the historical figure from the legend becomes increasingly difficult. Perhaps that ambiguity is appropriate. A prophet who built his reputation on mysterious, ambiguous predictions has become himself mysterious and ambiguous. We interpret Nostradamus just as we interpret his prophecies, finding in his life story whatever fits our preconceptions about prophecy, genius, fraud, or human nature. What remains undeniable is the cultural impact. 5 centuries after his death, people still buy his books. Publishers still release new editions with updated interpretations. Documentaries still explore his prophecies. Online forums still debate which quatrains predict current events. The name Nostradamus remains recognizable to people who know nothing else about 16th century France. This is the real prophecy, not specific predictions about future events, but the creation of something that would outlive its creator by centuries. Whether through calculated genius or fortunate accident, Nostradamus created a self-perpetuating mystery. Each generation discovers him anew, convinced they'll be the ones to finally crack the code. Each generation adds new interpretations, new analyses, new theories, and the legend grows larger with each retelling. The body stands in a wall in Salon. The books remain in print. The prophecies continue generating debate. And somewhere in that gap between what Nostradamus actually wrote and what people believe he wrote, between the historical figure and the mythical prophet, lies something that tells us more about ourselves than about the future. The question that haunts any serious examination of Nostradamus is this: did he actually believe he could see the future? The answer matters less than we might think. What matters is that he convinced others he believed it, and that conviction became contagious. Consider the mechanics of prophecy in the 16th century. The concept wasn't fringe or pseudo-scientific by contemporary standards. Astrology was taught at universities. Physicians consulted planetary positions before prescribing treatments. Kings employed court astrologers to determine auspicious dates for battles and weddings. The idea that celestial bodies influenced earthly events was mainstream science. Nostradamus operated within this accepted framework. His prophecies claimed legitimacy through astrological calculation, not divine revelation alone. He presented himself as someone who could read the cosmic blueprint, who understood the mathematical relationships between planetary movements and human affairs. This positioned him differently than religious prophets or village fortune tellers. He was offering something closer to specialized technical expertise, like a modern economist forecasting market trends. The predictions might prove wrong, but the methodology was respectable. The actual process he described for receiving visions mixed classical sources with contemporary occult practices. He claimed to use a method derived from ancient Greek oracles involving brass tripod and ritual preparations. Water featured prominently, perhaps as a scrying surface. Nighttime was essential. The imagery recalls temple priestesses at Delphi, adding classical gravitas to what might otherwise seem like peasant superstition. But here's what's fascinating. Nostradamus was careful never to fully explain his method. He gave enough detail to suggest legitimate practice, while maintaining enough mystery to prevent verification or replication. This balance protected him from both skeptics who might test his claims and imitators who might dilute his unique brand. The vagueness served multiple purposes. It allowed readers to imagine whatever prophetic process seemed most credible to them. It prevented the kind of detailed scrutiny that might expose inconsistencies. It maintained the sense that Nostradamus possessed special knowledge or abilities that couldn't be easily transferred or taught. Compare this to his medical practice, where he did share specific remedies and techniques. The difference is revealing. In medicine, sharing knowledge enhanced reputation. In prophecy, mystery was the product itself. The financial incentives were significant. The almanacs sold well. The prophecies sold better. Royal patronage brought money and protection. Nostradamus was supporting a family, maintaining a household, building a legacy. The prophecies were profitable in ways that medical practice had never been. This doesn't necessarily mean conscious fraud. The boundary between sincere belief and calculated performance was different in the 16th century. A doctor who claimed remedies worked when they didn't wasn't necessarily lying by contemporary standards. Medical theory was speculative. Cause and effect were poorly understood. If patients sometimes recovered, that was evidence enough. Similarly, a prophet whose predictions sometimes seemed to come true could reasonably claim success, even if the hits were coincidental and the misses forgotten. The human mind excels at finding patterns, especially when motivated to do so. Nostradamus had every incentive to interpret his own track record favourably. He'd survived the plague when colleagues died. He'd achieved fame when most provincial doctors remained obscure. He'd attracted royal attention despite humble origins. From his perspective, something was clearly working. Whether that something was prophetic ability, medical skill, literary talent, or simple luck mattered less than the results. The contemporary response to his prophecies reveals how differently his era thought about prediction. Modern readers expect specificity, exact dates, names, locations. Nostradamus' contemporaries expected symbolism and allegory. They were accustomed to biblical prophecy, which spoke in metaphors and required interpretation. They understood that divine or cosmic knowledge might not translate directly into human language. This expectation of interpretation was crucial to the prophecy's success. It meant that vagueness wasn't a bug but a feature. Unclear predictions weren't failures of prophetic ability, but necessary consequences of translating cosmic insight into words. The reader's job was to puzzle out the meaning, and that active participation created investment in the text. When you've spent hours trying to decode a quatrain, you're more likely to believe you've succeeded when you find a plausible interpretation. The publication strategy was sophisticated. The almanacs came first, establishing Nostradamus as someone whose predictions were worth reading. They contained specific predictions for the coming year: weather, harvests, political events. Many proved wrong, but enough seemed right to maintain credibility. The key was volume. Predict enough things and some will happen by chance. The prophecies took a different approach. By making predictions deliberately obscure and refusing to attach dates, Nostradamus protected himself from immediate verification. The quatrains couldn't be proven wrong because they could always be reinterpreted or assigned to future events not yet occurred. This was brilliant positioning. The almanacs provided regular income and maintained public profile. The prophecies built long-term reputation and ensured immortality. Together, they created a self-reinforcing system where short-term predictions supported belief in long-term prophetic ability, while the mysterious long-term predictions elevated the status of mundane short-term forecasts. The Catholic Church's relationship with the prophecies was complex. Officially, the Church disapproved of divination and fortune-telling. Prophecy was supposed to come from God through authorized channels, not from individuals consulting occult sources. But Nostradamus was careful. He emphasized divine inspiration rather than demonic influence. He framed his work as revealing God's plan, not attempting to control or change it. He dedicated his books to powerful figures who could provide protection. And he lived in a period when the Church had bigger concerns than one provincial prophet. The Reformation was fragmenting Christian Europe. The Ottoman Empire threatened from the east. Internal corruption demanded reform. A well-connected doctor publishing obscure verses in French posed minimal threat compared to Protestant heretics preaching in German or English. The Inquisition did investigate Nostradamus at one point, but the inquiry went nowhere. His connections protected him. His careful language gave little ground for charges. His prophecies, whatever else they were, weren't obviously heretical. The response from intellectual circles was mixed. Some scholars dismissed the prophecies as nonsense. Others took them seriously, attempting systematic interpretations. A few became devoted followers, seeing in Nostradamus a genuine seer whose work deserves scholarly attention. This range of responses itself contributed to the prophecy's longevity. Had everyone dismissed them, they might have vanished. Had everyone accepted them uncritically, they might have been quickly disproven and forgotten. The controversy kept them alive, ensuring each generation included both believers and skeptics, both defending and attacking. The personal toll of fame is harder to assess. Nostradamus left no diary describing his inner thoughts. His letters are formal, revealing little about his emotional state. But the pattern of his later life suggests someone who'd achieved success but found it burdensome. He complained about his health, about the demands of visitors seeking consultations, about the misinterpretation of his work. The prophecies had made him famous, but also made him a target for those seeking to exploit, discredit, or simply pester him. The move to the house in Salon, the construction of the study on the top floor, the increasing reclusiveness, all suggest someone trying to maintain space for work and thought against the intrusions of celebrity. He'd become a public figure, and public figures discover that fame is a prison with comfortable furnishings. The death at 62 wasn't particularly young by 16th century standards, but it wasn't old either. He'd outlived many contemporaries while dying before many others. The gouty condition that plagued his final years was common among the prosperous, a disease of rich diet and sedentary habits. His prediction of his own death, if genuine, might have been medical self-diagnosis rather than prophetic vision. A man with advancing gout and heart problems could reasonably anticipate death within months. The burial arrangement suggests someone conscious of posterity. The standing burial was unusual enough to be memorable. The request that no one disturb the grave shows awareness that fame might make his remains targets for relic hunters or grave robbers. And the metal plates, those were insurance. Whatever happened to the body, the message would remain. Here lies Nostradamus, prophet and doctor. The text you're reading is authentic. This is the real grave. Don't be fooled by pretenders. The centuries following his death saw the prophecies go through cycles of popularity. They sold steadily, but not spectacularly, for decades. Then came the French Revolution, and suddenly everyone was convinced Nostradamus had predicted it. Sales surged. New editions appeared with updated commentaries showing how the quatrains foretold revolutionary events. This pattern repeated through major crises. The Napoleonic Wars brought new attention. The World Wars prompted fresh interpretations. The Cold War, the space race, the millennium, September 11th, each generated waves of Nostradamus fever as people sought evidence that these events had been foreseen. The mechanism is always the same. Crisis creates anxiety. Anxiety drives people to seek explanations and patterns. The prophecies offer ready-made patterns waiting to be discovered. The vague language accommodates almost any interpretation, and the sheer volume of quatrains ensures that something can be made to fit almost any event. The modern publishing industry has built an entire genre around this cycle. Books claiming to decode Nostradamus appear regularly, each promising to reveal what previous interpreters missed. They sell particularly well during uncertain times, offering the comfort of knowability in an unknowable world. The internet amplified this phenomenon exponentially. Websites, forums, YouTube channels, social media accounts, all dedicated to analysing, debating, and promoting Nostradamus interpretations. The barrier to publishing disappeared. Anyone with an internet connection could become a Nostradamus expert, sharing their theories with global audiences. This democratization of interpretation had contradictory effects. On one hand, it exposed the arbitrariness of readings. When everyone can propose interpretations and they all contradict each other, the lack of objective criteria becomes obvious. On the other hand, it created self-reinforcing communities where believers could find support, regardless of how implausible their readings seemed to outsiders. The academic study of Nostradamus took a different path. Serious scholars approached the texts as historical documents, trying to understand what they meant in 16th century context, rather than what they might predict about the present or future. This scholarship revealed much about Nostradamus' sources, his methods, his historical circumstances. It showed convincingly that most quatrains referred to events contemporary or recent to Nostradamus' time, drawn from historical chronicles and current events. The prophecies were less about the distant future than about demonstrating knowledge of historical patterns. But academic consensus matters little to popular belief. The scholarly articles sit in university libraries, while the popular books sit on airport bookstore shelves. The careful historical analysis reaches hundreds, while the documentary claiming Nostradamus predicted smartphones reaches millions. This is the final irony of Nostradamus' legacy. The more we know about the historical figure, the less mysterious he becomes. The more carefully we analyze the texts, the less prophetic they appear. Yet none of this knowledge dims the popular fascination. If anything, debunking seems to strengthen belief among devotees, who see skepticism as proof that establishment authorities fear the truth. The prophecies have become unfalsifiable. When predictions seem accurate, that's evidence of prophetic power. When they don't, that's evidence we haven't properly understood them yet. When scholars show they refer to 16th century events, that's evidence of both historical knowledge and future prediction through symbolic encoding. Every argument against becomes an argument for, reframed through the lens of belief. This dynamic tells us something important about why prophecy persists, despite centuries of failed predictions. The appeal isn't really about accurate forecasting, it's about meaning and control. Prophecy suggests that history follows patterns, that chaos is actually order we don't yet understand, that someone somewhere knows what's coming. In an uncertain world, that's deeply comforting. Nostradamus provides that comfort. Not through specific, accurate predictions, those are rare to non-existent, but through the suggestion that prediction is possible, that the future isn't random, that if we're clever enough, observant enough, willing enough to study the signs, we too might glimpse what's coming. The man from Saint-Remy didn't need to actually see the future. He needed to convince people that the future could be seen, and that he'd seen it. That conviction, once established, became self-sustaining. Each generation finds new reasons to believe, new events that seem to match, new quatrains that suddenly make sense. The cycle continues, fed by human nature's need for pattern and meaning. And perhaps that's the real genius of Michel de Nostradamus. Not prophetic ability, but understanding something fundamental about how humans think about time and fate and knowledge. He created a text that would remain relevant precisely because it said nothing specific enough to be definitively wrong. In its vagueness lay its immortality. The ultimate question isn't whether Nostradamus could see the future, it's whether we needed him to. Consider what the prophecies actually accomplished. They didn't prevent wars, didn't avert disasters, didn't save lives through advance warning. No government changed policy based on a quatrain. No military altered strategy because Nostradamus predicted defeat. The predictions, even when believers claimed they were accurate, came with recognition only after the fact, when they could no longer help anyone. What they did accomplish was psychological. They transformed random tragedy into predicted event, chaos into pattern, meaningless suffering into part of a grand design. When the world felt most out of control, the prophecies whispered that someone had seen it coming, that it was all somehow meant to be. This explains why Nostradamus resurfaces during historical crises, not because the prophecies become more accurate during turbulent times, but because the need for their comfort becomes more acute. When society fractures, when the future seems most uncertain, we reach for anything suggesting someone knows what's coming. The 16th century had its own crises that drove people to prophecy, religious wars that seemed to have no resolution, plague returning cyclically with no understanding of cause. political instability as old feudal orders collapsed and new structures emerged. In that context, a man claiming to have seen the shape of things to come offered hope that the chaos was temporary, that beyond the confusion lay some comprehensible order. 5 centuries later, different crises produce the same hunger. The prophecies get dusted off, reinterpreted for new audiences, applied to new fears. The specific anxieties change, but the underlying need remains constant. We want to believe that history moves according to some plan, even if that plan is known only to a French physician who died in 1566. But this belief carries consequences beyond mere comfort. When people become convinced that the future is predetermined and knowable, it shapes how they engage with the present. Why work to prevent disaster if disaster is prophesied? Why struggle to change outcomes if outcomes are fixed? Fatalism, masquerading as prophecy, can become self-fulfilling, not because the prophet saw truly, but because belief in prophecy altered behavior. Nostradamus likely understood this dynamic. His letters show someone keenly aware of human psychology, of how to position himself, of what people wanted to hear. The vagueness of the quatrains wasn't accidental incompetence. It was strategic genius. Specific predictions can be proven wrong. Vague suggestions can never be. He also understood the power of mystique, the elaborate rituals he claimed to perform, the invocations of ancient wisdom, the astrological calculations. These weren't necessary for prediction if he actually possessed prophetic ability. They were theatre, designed to make the prophecies seem more legitimate, more rooted in arcane knowledge beyond common understanding. The mythology that grew around him after death amplified this mystique exponentially. Stories of his supernatural abilities multiplied with each retelling. The modest physician became a wizard. The careful astrologer became a seer communing with cosmic forces. The struggling writer became a prophet whose every word dripped with hidden meaning. None of it required any actual prophetic ability. It only required that first generation of believers to start the process and human nature to sustain it. Each person who found meaning in a quatrain became an evangelist, sharing their discovery, convincing others. The belief spread not through evidence but through social transmission, one converted reader at a time. This social dimension explains why Nostradamus persists while other prophets fade. He accumulated enough believers early enough that a self-sustaining community formed. That community developed its own experts, its own traditions of interpretation, its own standards of evidence. It became an ecosystem that could survive indefinitely, immune to outside criticism because it generated its own internal validation. Modern technology amplified this process dramatically. Before the internet, Nostradamus enthusiasts were isolated, scattered across geography, limited to whatever books they could find. Now they form global networks, sharing interpretations instantly, coordinating responses to skeptics, creating endless content that feeds the algorithm and attracts new believers. The documentary about Nostradamus predicting smartphones reaches millions, not because it's true, but because it's engaging. The YouTube video analysing quatrains for signs of World War III gets recommended not because it's accurate, but because it generates watch time. The social media post connecting Nostradamus to current events goes viral not because it's insightful, but because it's shareable. Truth becomes irrelevant in an attention economy. What matters is engagement, and prophecy is deeply engaging. It creates mystery, suggests hidden knowledge, promises insider understanding to those willing to decode the signs. These are catnip to human psychology, far more appealing than scholarly articles explaining 16th century publishing practices. The irony is that Nostradamus himself would likely recognize this dynamic. He was a showman, a marketer, someone who understood how to capture attention and build reputation. If he could see how his prophecies function in the 21st century, he might be amused by how little has changed in the fundamentals of human credulity, even as the technology for spreading that credulity has transformed completely. But perhaps the deepest irony is that the prophecies have become genuinely predictive in one way Nostradamus never intended. They predict human behavior, not specific events, but the reliable patterns of how people respond to uncertainty. Every time a crisis emerges, we can predict with near certainty that someone will claim Nostradamus foresaw it. Every time that claim is made, we can predict that some portion of the population will believe it. Every time belief spreads, we can predict that no amount of debunking will eliminate it entirely. These patterns are more reliable than any quatrain. They tell us something real about human psychology, about our relationship with the future, about what we need to believe, even when evidence suggests we shouldn't. The scholars who study Nostradamus historically have given us invaluable knowledge about Renaissance publishing, 16th century astrology, the mechanics of reputation building, the sociology of belief. They've shown definitively what the prophecies actually were, commercial publications by a clever writer working in a popular genre. But that knowledge hasn't ended the prophecy's influence, and it never will. Because the belief in Nostradamus isn't really about Michel de Nostradam. It's about us, about our need for pattern and meaning, about our discomfort with randomness, about our hope that someone somewhere understands what's coming. The man who died in Salon de Provence in 1566 was mortal, limited, bound by the constraints of his time and knowledge. The myth that grew from his writings is immortal, unlimited, adapting endlessly to new contexts. The man could only see as far as his own historical moment. The myth sees everywhere people need it to see. This is why Nostradamus will outlive every debunking, every scholarly refutation, every failed prediction. Not because he was right, but because the need he fulfills is eternal. As long as humans face uncertain futures, we'll seek prophets. As long as we seek prophets, Nostradamus will be there, his quatrains ready to be reinterpreted for whatever age discovers them. The prophecies aren't windows into the future. They're mirrors reflecting our present anxieties back at us, dressed in the costume of prediction. Each generation sees its own fears in the verses, finds its own crisis foretold, discovers its own meaning in the ambiguity. And perhaps that's not entirely worthless. If the prophecies help people process uncertainty, find meaning in chaos, feel less alone in their anxiety about what's coming, then they serve a purpose even while being objectively wrong about the future. The comfort may be false, but false comfort still comforts. The danger comes when false comfort prevents true action. When belief in prophesied outcomes replaces effort to shape those outcomes. When fatalism, masquerading as foreknowledge, paralyzes response to genuine threats. The line between helpful meaning-making and harmful passivity is thin. Nostradamus never claimed his prophecies were meant to change the future. In his view, they revealed what must happen, not what might be prevented. This deterministic framework absolves everyone of responsibility. If it's written in the stars, if the prophet saw it centuries ago, what can we do? But the future isn't written. It's being written right now by billions of small decisions and actions, compounding into outcomes no one can truly predict. The uncertainty that drives people to prophecy is real, but it's also the space where human agency operates. The inability to see clearly what's coming isn't a bug in reality. It's the feature that makes choice meaningful. Michel de Nostradam lived in that uncertain space like everyone else. He didn't transcend it through prophetic vision. He monetized it through clever writing. The difference matters. 5 centuries later, we're still living in that same uncertainty, still facing futures we cannot predict, still susceptible to anyone claiming they've glimpsed what's ahead. The technology changes, the specific anxieties evolve, but the fundamental human relationship with the unknown remains remarkably constant. And somewhere in that continuity lies the real lesson of Nostradamus. Not about prophecy or the future, but about ourselves, about what we're willing to believe when we're frightened, about how easily pattern recognition becomes pareidolia, seeing meaningful images in random noise, about how comfort sometimes matters more than truth. The quatrains will continue finding new meanings, new audiences, new relevance. Someone is reading them right now, convinced they've found the key that previous interpreters missed. Someone else is writing a new book, claiming new discoveries, adding to the endless pile of Nostradamus literature. The machine perpetuates itself without any need for actual prophetic ability. That's the real genius of what Michel de Nostradamus created. Not a window into the future, but an endlessly renewable resource of meaning. A text that can never be exhausted because it never said anything definite to begin with. Poetry vague enough to remain forever relevant, published at just the right moment to catch the rising wave of commercial printing and popular prophecy. He couldn't have predicted how far his fame would spread, how long his words would echo, but he set in motion something that took on a life of its own, something that outlived him by centuries and shows no signs of fading. In that sense, perhaps he did achieve a kind of immortality, though not the kind he claimed. The prophecies will outlive us too. Long after we're gone, people will still be finding new meanings in the quatrains, still convinced that this 16th century physician somehow saw their specific moment, their particular crisis, their unique time. The cycle continues, generation after generation, because it's not really about Nostradamus at all. It's about us, confronting the oldest human fear, that the future is unknowable, that we're moving through time without a map, that anything could happen and we won't see it coming. The prophecies don't actually solve that problem. They just make it feel like someone else did. And maybe that's enough for most people. Maybe the illusion of prediction serves us better than acknowledging the void. Maybe false certainty beats honest uncertainty. Maybe we need our prophets, even knowing they're wrong. Or maybe we're capable of something better, of facing the unknown without needing someone to pretend they've seen through it, of accepting uncertainty as the price of genuine freedom, of making choices without the crutch of claimed foreknowledge. Michel de Nostradamus can't answer that question for us. He's been dead for 458 years. His prophecies, misunderstood, misinterpreted, and endlessly recycled, continue without him. They'll continue without us too. The only question is what we choose to do with them, whether we let them comfort us into passivity or use them as a reminder that the future isn't written, that prophecy is impossible, and that our choices matter precisely because no one knows how things will turn out. That uncertainty is where we actually live, not in a world of prophecy and predestination, but in the space between what we know and what we fear. Nostradamus offered an escape from that space. 5 centuries of failed predictions suggest we should stop trying to escape it and learn to live there honestly instead. The prophecies will survive this conclusion, just as they've survived every other. But at least now you know what you're looking at when you see them. Not windows into tomorrow, but mirrors of today. Not prescience, but pattern recognition gone wild. Not prophecy, but poetry that got taken too seriously. And that might be the most useful thing anyone can tell you about the most famous prophet who never actually predicted anything at all. The house on Rue de la Poissonnerie still stands. Tourists photograph it. The grave in Saint-Laurent still draws visitors. The prophecies still sell. And none of it matters in the way believers think it does. Because here's what we've actually learned about Michel de Nostradamus. He was a capable physician who survived plague through a combination of skill, unconventional methods, and extraordinary luck. He was a clever writer who understood how to package predictions in language vague enough to survive indefinitely. He was a shrewd businessman who built a brand that would outlive him by centuries. And he was a man who lived through catastrophic uncertainty and found a way to profit from everyone else's need to believe someone understood what was coming. That's not prophecy. That's genius of a different kind entirely. The real prediction wasn't in the quatrains. It was in the structure itself. Nostradamus predicted that humans would never stop searching for patterns in chaos, that we'd continue projecting our fears onto ambiguous texts, that the hunger for certainty would override evidence indefinitely. That prediction has proven absolutely accurate for 500 years. But it didn't require supernatural insight. It only required understanding something that anyone watching people during crisis could observe. We're terrified of randomness. We'll grasp at anything suggesting the future follows comprehensible rules. We'd rather believe in false prophecy than accept genuine uncertainty. The prophecies exploit this vulnerability brilliantly. They offer just enough specificity to seem meaningful, while remaining vague enough to fit almost anything. They suggest insider knowledge while never quite delivering it. They promise answers while providing only more questions. It's a perfect system for generating endless engagement without ever being definitively proven wrong. And perhaps that's the final lesson. Not about Nostradamus, but about us. About what we're willing to believe when reality feels uncontrollable. About how easily we mistake pattern recognition for prophecy, coincidence for confirmation, ambiguity for accuracy. Every time someone claims Nostradamus predicted the latest crisis, they're not revealing hidden knowledge. They're revealing something about themselves. Their fears, their need for meaning, their discomforts with acknowledging that most of history unfolds through accident and contingency rather than divine plan. The man who wrote those quatrains understood this on some level. Whether he believed his own claims remains unknowable, but he definitely understood that people wanted to believe, and he gave them something to believe in. The fact that it meant nothing specific didn't matter. The fact that it could mean anything was precisely the point. 5 centuries later, we're still playing the game he invented, still finding new crises in old verses, still convinced that this time we've cracked the code, still certain that previous interpreters missed what we've discovered. The cycle perpetuates itself automatically now, requiring no conscious fraud or deliberate deception. Just human nature doing what human nature does. So when you encounter the next claim that Nostradamus predicted whatever catastrophe currently dominates headlines, you'll know what you're actually seeing. Not prophecy fulfilled, but psychology exploited. Not evidence of supernatural foresight, but proof that the anxiety driving people to seek prophecy hasn't changed since 1555. The future remains exactly as unknowable as it always was. The difference is now you understand why people keep pretending otherwise, and that understanding is worth more than any prophecy ever written.